Abortion happens every day. Millions of people around the world will have an abortion each year. But the majority of those people will never talk about their abortion experiences. What if millions of people broke their silence and told the truth about their lives and their choices? This is Melissa Madera in Toronto, Canada, and you're listening to the Abortion Diary podcast. These are the stories we share.
I grew up as a somewhat evangelical Christian. My parents were not quite as conservative as I was, and I had started in on this conservative church group when I was a teenager and had gotten really involved and through a series of events ended up at seminary, but also much more liberal than I had been as a teenager. And inside of seminary, I wasn't really fitting in super well, but continued on with it and became a minister and was working at a church setting when I decided to become a hospital chaplain. And as a hospital chaplain, you have to do a year-long residency. And went to do my residency in the town that I'd grown up in and graduated from my residency. And when I was doing my residency, I had met this fantastic man and we had started dating. And we were really happy together. And when I graduated from that residency, I knew that I didn't want to leave town. I'd been offered a job in Guatemala. There were other hospitals I could apply to, but I wanted to stay here with him. And so I found a church job about 40 minutes away and had started there and was working at the church, always knowing that I wanted to go back into hospital chaplaincy, that was my ultimate goal as soon as something popped up. And when I found a hospital chaplain job at a Catholic hospital, it was only 8 months into that other job at the church. And so this job at the hospital was working nights. And so I was working all night long and then going to work at the church. And I worked specifically night weekends. And so I'd finish work at 6 o'clock in the morning at the hospital and then drive 40 minutes up to this small town, do 2 worship services, teach Sunday school, and then drive back down, get a couple hours of sleep before going back into work again. And in the midst of all this, we decided it'd be a good idea to get a puppy. And so we got a puppy, and we were having a hard time as a couple raising this puppy together. And I was sleep deprived, and I think in that month we had sex one time. And it was when he'd gotten back from his sister's house. And it was just a really super stressful time. And at one point, I was sitting at my desk at the church and had realized that my period seemed a little later than what it normally should have been. And I'm on birth control pills, and so I knew when it should have been. And I was sitting at my desk, and I suddenly got super paranoid about when my period was coming and when it was going to be, and decided at that moment I was just going to go to the drugstore so I wouldn't be worried about it anymore, and went to the nearest CVS and bought like the store brand, so not the fancy kind, but just the store brand, and went back to church and sat in one of the church stalls and took the pregnancy test. And as soon as it came back positive, I pulled up my phone and was Googling, are store brand pregnancy tests reliable? And was trying really hard to make sure that I actually wasn't pregnant. And ended up driving to a Walmart so I could buy another pregnancy test, bought like 3 boxes, drank more water than I ever have in a 2-hour period, and went through all of them, and they were all positive. And that night I had a speaking engagement. I sometimes do some speaking on human trafficking. And I had a speaking engagement, so I knew I wasn't going to be able to talk to my boyfriend at the time. And we were living together. We still are. And so I knew I wasn't going to be able to talk to him, and I wanted to. I just had to tell him right away. And so I called him and asked if he could meet me at home before I went to the speaking engagement. And we met at home, and I burst into tears and told him that I was pregnant. And he looks at me and he says, I thought it might be that. When you called, I knew that it was probably going to be that. And he said, so do we call a doctor, and do we start doing doctor's appointments for this and start telling our parents? And I'm like, well, we need to decide what we're going to do first. And it was a really kind of safe feeling for me knowing that the first option was to default to this is okay, this is all okay. And then the next one was, okay, we'll make a decision together. And we talked about it briefly. And I went to do that speaking engagement and came back, and we talked about it some more. And I had started looking online and found a website called Sister Zeus that has some great research on it about women's reproductive rights and herbs and different things like that. And so I said, well, let's try this first so we can avoid the whole abortion fiasco. And we tried that, and it just wasn't working. I was taking them every 2 to 3 hours. I was waking up in the middle of the night. In the meantime, I was working 2 jobs, 1 days, 1 nights, and was just miserable all this time thinking I can't raise a puppy. How am I going to raise a child? And I started at that time kind of researching abortion clinics in our area, to which there are none. The closest one's 2.5 hours away. And kind of found myself looking into the moralism surrounding abortion, things that I'd never really worried about before because it didn't affect me personally. And I'm kind of going through the scriptures, and I'm seeing in Hosea where God commands that someday the Syrians will have the babies ripped out of their mother's wombs, and I see in Exodus where the firstborn is to be destroyed in the plague. And the one that really got me was in Leviticus, where it says that a child's only worth money to its parents after 1 month. So a baby boy is worth 5 shekels after 1 month, and a baby girl is worth 3 shekels. But before then, the baby isn't worth anything to anybody. So if you kill somebody's baby before then, it's completely fine. And there's a place in Numbers where it talks about an actual abortion kind of potion that you're supposed to give to some woman when she's cheating, and if she aborts the baby, then it wasn't her husband's, and if she doesn't, then it was, and she's a righteous woman. And I'm sitting there going, well, all this doesn't add up in my head. And when you look at the teachings of Jesus, there's nothing about abortion, and it's not that it didn't exist, it's not that it wasn't an option, it just isn't there. And so I'd kind of looked into that and researched all that and researched the herbs, and they weren't working. And I went back and talked with my partner, and we decided that we were going to go ahead and have an abortion. And so the nearest abortion clinic to us is Nashville, Tennessee. And we called there, and I knew that in 2 weeks I was going to be in Nashville for a marathon, and I was going to be running the marathon with my parents and with my partner. And I was hoping that all of us we'd be down there, and I could just take care of it, and it would be done. It wouldn't be a big deal, and go home, and nobody would ever know. And so I sat in my partner's car, and we called together, and I was crying. And I wasn't crying so much because of the abortion. I don't think I was crying really because I didn't envision my life being this. I didn't think I'd ever have to be in a situation where I was making this call and this decision. And I remember the lady on the other end of the phone saying, "Are you sure you want to do this?" And immediately I stopped crying and said, "Yes, I'm sure I want to do this." That it really wasn't an option in my mind. I knew that we were too busy, that I loved my job, and if someone found out I was pregnant out of wedlock, I'd lose my job, and I'd lose my credentialing as an ordained minister, so I wouldn't be able to go on to be a board certified chaplain, and all of this hard work and all these things that I'd worked for would be over and done, and that just wasn't an option for me at that time. And so they ended up being able to fit us in on the Friday before the marathon in Nashville. And we drove down there together and stayed the night in a hotel room. and got up early the next morning and drove to the abortion clinic, which is in kind of a crappy part of town. It was not in a good area, and outside were all of these protesters. And it was a weird thought to me that, like, these are supposed to be my people. These are supposed to be the people who I work with, who pay me to do my work, who trust me. Then they're outside protesting against me. And as we walked in, my partner's hand was on my back, and it was just kind of like he was trying to shield me from everything that was going on. And we get in there, and they tell me that I need a blood test to see if I'm Rh negative. And I said, well, I know that I am. I work in a clinical setting. I know that I'm an A negative blood type. And they said, doesn't matter, we need to test your blood. So then in Nashville, they actually make you leave the clinic again and go to the university 3 or 4 blocks away. So you walk in past the protesters, you walk out again past the protesters, and in again past the protesters. And it was just miserable. It was so miserable. And I was so angry and sad and disappointed and all of those kind of weird feelings. And then I just remember waiting. We just waited and waited and waited. And the whole process took 6 hours total. And I just did the medical pill. And that was not something that I was expecting, because I knew all I was going to get were these 2 pills and that would be it. But it took 6 hours for me to get those 2 pills. And we sat in the waiting room and waited to be called back, and they did an ultrasound, and the person in the ultrasound room, I think, was maybe a physician in training, and she was probably the nicest person through the whole experience. That everybody else was either really clinical or almost, I perceived at least, as judgy. They may or may not have been. That may just have been my experience, my perception. And she was really kind. She asked if I wanted a printout of the ultrasound. And at first I said, no, of course not. And I thought about it. I said, yeah, actually, I would like a printout. So she printed out the picture of the ultrasound. And I had mentioned that I was in Nashville to run the marathon the next day. And she brought somebody else back in the room with me. And they said, I heard you're going to be a rock star tomorrow. And they tried to tell me not to do it, but I knew that I was supposed to be doing this race with my parents, and the last thing I wanted to do was explain to my parents why I couldn't run this race that I've been training for. And she said, well, how about this? How about if you start to have trouble, you find a medical tent, you tell them that you're just having a miscarriage, and let them take care of you that way. And I thought that was really kind of her, and really sensitive to probably what I was going through and the conflict that was going to be there. And they sent me back out to the waiting room, and we sat in the waiting room, and we waited and we waited and we waited and we waited. And then they called a large group of us back, maybe 20 of us, into a large room where I think they showed a video and that explained what was happening and what we needed to do. And after the video was over, they called us back into a smaller room one by one. And I was sitting next to another girl who was reading the book Jane Eyre, and that's my very favorite book of all time. And I kind of commented on it to her, and she asked what I liked about it. And we were having this totally innocuous conversation about classic literature while we were both waiting to have an abortion. And it just struck me as one of the weirdest moments in my life that I was talking to this woman, and we both knew what the other was about to go through, but neither one of us wanted to talk about it, and we were just going to talk about this book instead. Whereas I knew something intimate about her that she probably wouldn't tell many people, and she knew something intimate about me that I wasn't going to tell many people. And eventually my name was called, and I went back, and there was a doctor there, and she gave me the pill and told me to take another one so many hours later, and a script for antibiotics. And she watched me take the pill, and then she just kind of looked at me and she goes, okay, that's it. And I was like, okay, that's it. And left, and paid, which was way more expensive than I ever thought it would be. And every time I hear about Planned Parenthood funding going to abortions, it makes me angry because that is simply not the case. And we left and had dinner with my parents that night before the race and got up the next morning. And in the meantime, we had gone to the pharmacy nearby the abortion clinic. And I remember that being really uncomfortable as well, because I felt like the people working behind the counter knew. I was thinking about all the people that must go into that CVS or Walgreens or whatever it was every day, and how they see the same script every day and they know what each of us are doing. And I felt really uncomfortable, and got that and went back and had dinner with my parents and got some sleep. And the next morning got up and it was pouring down rain. It was the most miserable race of my life. And we finished and had lunch with my parents, and then we drove home. And on the way home was when I was supposed to take the second pill. And so I took that second pill on the way home, and when we got home, we just spent the day sitting on the couch watching movies. And I pulled the duvet off our bed and just curled up on the couch with the duvet and fell asleep. And the next morning I got up and went to church. And that was kind of the last I thought about it for at least a week. And, my period started. And so it really almost felt more like just having a period than it did having a procedure. And I started having a large cramp, and I had passed the egg sac. Something passed. And my partner was out walking the dog, and I was like, I think I just passed the baby. I was like, do you want to see it or no? And God love him, he's the most patient man in the world. He's like, okay. And so I showed it to him, and we were talking about what we wanted to do with this thing, because we didn't want to flush it and we didn't want to throw it away. And so we put it in our freezer. We put it in a little baggie and stuck it in our freezer until we could figure out what we wanted to do with it. And I think he came up with the idea of buying a tree. And at that time we were renting. And so my parents own a bunch of land, and we went together to the store and bought a tree and took the ultrasound picture and the products of conception, for lack of a better word, to my parents' property when they were gone one weekend, and we planted this tree and the products of conception. And it's, as far as I know, still there. We still go out and visit it whenever we're out at my parents' house. And so part of what I do at the hospital is I am the chaplain in charge of women and children. So my job is to work with women who are having miscarriages. And since I work at a Catholic hospital, we are not allowed to do abortions, or even, God forbid, say the word abortion. But we are very good about working with women who are experiencing miscarriage. And we have a cemetery, a Catholic cemetery here in town, that will bury all of the miscarried fetuses. Every year, twice a year, we have a common burial for them, and part of my job is to lead this common burial and walk with the mothers who are miscarrying. And it was exactly 1 year to the day that I miscarried that a common burial was scheduled. And my partner has since said the saddest thing he thinks he's ever seen was me standing over that grave the 1 year anniversary after I had a miscarriage. But it is in no way something that I regret. It was absolutely the right decision at the right time for my family and for us. We did end up raising our dog into a good adulthood, which was a large triumph for us. And it was such a good decision. In this last 2 weeks, I was out visiting my brother and sister-in-law, and they just had my parents' first grandbaby, and so the first baby in my family. And I was helping my sister-in-law take care of the baby, and I was holding this little girl and looking at her and thinking, I will never, ever, ever let anything bad happen to you. And I was so filled with love for this little creature, and wanted so badly to protect her. But there's nothing in me that thinks that was a bad decision, or that was something that I shouldn't have done. It was a good decision for me. I think that's it.
Thank you. When you went to Nashville, you went for this marathon with your parents and your partner, and you decided not to tell your parents. Is that still the case?
Still the case. In fact, a couple weeks ago, we were sitting at brunch with my mother, and we were having an abortion talk. And I think I will probably never tell my mother that I have had an abortion. In fact, until this time, the only person that knows that I've had an abortion is my partner and my very best friend. Or not my very best friend, but a really close friend of mine knows. And so that's it. My mom's an OB nurse, and so she has had the joy of watching so many babies brought into the world that I think it's something that is very close to her heart. And at the time she was talking about more of late-term abortions. That was something that bothered her a lot more than I think probably what I went through. But there's some things that people in your life don't necessarily need to know because it distresses them. And I think it's just one of those things that it would be something that would make me feel better, or something that I would need to say to get off of my chest, but wouldn't do much for my mother. And so kind of an as-need-to-know thing.
Mm-hmm. The same with your siblings?
Yeah, both of my brothers. I have one brother that we butt heads a lot. And my other brother, I could probably tell, and he would be like, oh, okay, that's fine, and wouldn't really care one way or another. In fact, he would probably respect me a little more for it. But it just hasn't come up, and I've never really felt the need to distress him with it. And we had a molar pregnancy this last year, which is a pregnancy that develops as a tumor instead of as a baby. And had to have a medical DNC, and so we had it at the Catholic hospital that I work at, which was a very different experience than, and I can remember thinking that at the time, how compassionate and how kind the nurses were compared to the nurses that I'd experienced in Nashville. And I told my brother at the time, was the only person that I had talked to outside of my partner about that, and he was so great with it, and I really don't think he'd care much one way or another. But in fact, it really wouldn't surprise me if he's dated somebody who's had an abortion. But it's kind of an as-need-to-know thing for me, especially with my job. I worry so much that it's going to affect my all the education and all the time and all the work I've put into getting where I am.
So you're concerned about your community?
Yes. And as a chaplain, I've kind of learned that you disclose information as it makes people around you comfortable or better or whatever they need at that time. And if it doesn't, then you're just spewing something for you. And there's therapists for that. And I do have a good therapist, or I did. And that's the time to do that. But when I talk to a woman who's struggling with something, then I feel like it would be okay to disclose what I'm going through if that helps them. Otherwise, it's why distress somebody that you love, in my mind.
Is it something that you talk to and process with your partner with?
Yes, we have talked a lot about it. And I don't know if it is something that has bothered him as much as it has me. And we've talked about how things are much more real for a female than a male in a pregnancy. And in fact, when I had the molar pregnancy, he didn't feel like the pregnancy was real. It wasn't after the D&C that he felt like the pregnancy was real. It was my follow-up appointment when he watched the doctor do a pap smear on me, or a cervical exam. And when he was sitting in the room watching the doctor do a cervical exam, he really is the most sensitive man on God's green earth. He was all of a sudden like, oh my gosh, there was a baby, and that baby was a tumor, and it became really real and scary. And so he's let me process it as much as I have needed to, but has otherwise I don't think has struggled as much as I have, but has come up with clever solutions like the tree. And in fact, we have a tree in our yard now for the molar pregnancy as well. And those have kind of been his urgings, which has been really kind. And he hasn't minded when I've kept things like products in conception in the freezer. It's been helpful for me.
You'll also mention the cost of the procedure and that it was very expensive. How much did it cost? And your insurance didn't cover it?
Oh, no. And because I work at a Catholic health facility, so my insurance doesn't cover my birth control, which is a sore subject for me. And so it was $800 for my abortion in Nashville. And I can remember walking up to the window, and when she gave me the price, looking down at my credit card and wanting to cry because I was so close to paying it off and just handing it over, and that just being it. And my partner had offered to help and pay for it, but for some reason it was really important for me to do that. I've gone back and forth with feeling so connected to that child and wanting to know that life that would have been is somehow significant and special to me, which is why I think the tree was important, and why it was kind of important for me to pay for it, that it was something that I could do for this soul, and recognizing that there was a significance there for me, even if it was the right decision for me at the right time.
Can you share with us how you completed the ritual?
Yeah, we had gone to, I think, like Home Depot, and went through and picked out the best tree that we could find, the one that we really liked, and went back. I was staying at my parents' house at the time. They were out of town, and I watched their dogs when they go out of town. And we took everything that had reminded us of that experience. So the ultrasound picture, maybe even like the receipt that I had, and the products of conception, and we put it all inside of a mason jar and sealed the mason jar. And my parents live out on a lot of property, and we went to kind of at the edge of the property, and my partner dug a hole, and we put the mason jar in the bottom and then the tree over top of it. And being a minister, I have to add a little brevity to it, and so I think I actually had brought my notes that I use for funerals out with me, and said a couple things from that. And I think we buried the mason jar and the roots of the tree together, so that we were both doing it at the same time. And when we finished, we kind of stood there quietly for a couple moments and then just walked back together to my parents' house. The tree is still there as far as we know. I checked on it maybe a month and a half ago, and it was starting to change for the fall. It was getting a different color. And the only thing I wish I would have done at that time was get a fruit tree, because that way, if we ever moved or we went someplace else, we could actually grow another tree off of that. And we ended up doing that with our second pregnancy. That was a loss instead of an abortion. Both of them were losses. That's a horrible term for it, but was my body getting rid of it. And we bought a fruit tree then, a cherry tree. So that way, if we ever move, we can start to grow another tree off of that cherry tree.
Why do you want to share your story?
I think that our experiences are not our own. That when we live around other people, we have an obligation to share those experiences. And I know that there have been a lot of women that I've spoken to in the hospital that have struggled with the morality of abortion, that they've struggled with the guilt that comes with it. And when I told my friend I was going to do this project, she said, I just think you can do so much good by telling your story. And that's kind of my hope, that if I can share this in a way that makes an impact or helps somebody get over their own abortion experience, or whatever good can come from something like this, that's my hope. And my other one is that as a minister, you live in a lot of secrecy, that it has been a job where I have had to hide a lot of who I am and what I have done for the sake of making parishioners think that I am good and holy and wonderful and above everything else. And it has caused problems for me. And it's something that I have spoken to my therapist about, and he has encouraged me to keep being honest, to keep sharing experiences and not hiding them or who I am. And this is kind of a step towards allowing that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have one more question.
Sure.
So you mentioned you told one friend,
Mm-hmm.
and you mentioned her again just now. So I just wonder what made her a good person to tell.
We grew up in the same evangelical group together. We went to church together, then went to this parachurch organization together, and have simultaneously, yet in different spots, evolved into much more liberal people than what we started off as. In fact, she was a member of the Young Republicans Club growing up, and now she kind of wants to vomit at that memory. And I recently did her wedding, and she married an atheist, and we were laughing about how far she's come and how different he is from the conservative combination of Albert Einstein and George Bush that she had wanted for herself. And when I told her, I knew that it wasn't only something that she would not judge me for, it would be something that she would celebrate with me as a choice that I had made, and it was the right choice for me. And she has. I mean, it's not something that we go, yay, we had an abortion, but it's something that she celebrates, that women make choices for their health care and their bodies that are important to them. And she walks that journey with me in a way that makes it feel validated and special and not secretive and scary and something that I have to lie about.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there anything else you'd like to share?
I'm very appreciative of the experience to be able to tell the story beginning to end. And I think I've heard other women say on the podcast that that's the first time that they've been able to do that. And it is for me as well, and I am really thankful for that.
Thank you. How do you feel now that you've shared?
Relieved. I mean, it is a nice feeling to know that it isn't just something that I have held on to, that it's something that I can share as a community now, that there are other women who can walk beside me, that it's not such an alone feeling.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to listen to more of our stories, head over to our website, theabortiondiary.com, subscribe on iTunes, or listen on SoundCloud or Stitcher Radio. If you would like to share your own abortion story, visit us on our webpage, Click on Share Your Abortion Story and send me a message. To learn more about how to support the Abortion Diary, head over to our website and click on the donate button. You can also support the Abortion Diary by telling your friends. Following the Abortion Diary on Twitter at Abortion Diary, on Instagram at The Abortion Diary, and on Facebook. You can also follow me on Instagram at The Abortion Diarist. Stay tuned for the next story.